It was winter break, and I had the house to myself. The crisp air outside seemed to whisper through the windows, a reminder of the stillness that had taken over the world beyond. The trees outside were bare, their branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal hands, and the snow had settled over everything, creating a blanket of silence. Inside, everything felt comfortable, almost too comfortable. The kind of quiet that should have been peaceful, but instead, it seemed to settle a little too. I had decided to spend the evening in the sunroom, which we had transformed into a cozy little movie space. The blinds were drawn, the dim glow of the TV flickering against the darkness of the room. I was wrapped in a blanket, trying to relax, but there was an unease in the back of my mind. It wasn't that I was scared of being home alone per se. In fact, I had always enjoyed the solitude. The house was quiet, and for the first time in a long time, I could hear my own thoughts, uninterrupted by the noise of everyday life. It was a break from the chaos, a brief escape into peace. But peace can be a strano and so on. There's something unnerving about being completely alone in a house that should feel safe. The silence, once comforting, begins to feel oppressive. You start to hear things that aren't really there. Your mind plays tricks on you. It was this feeling, this awareness of my isolation, that began to gnaw at the edges of my cowl. The first thing that caught my attention was the motion-sensing light outside. I had left the blinds shut, assuming everything was just as it should be, but suddenly, the light outside flickered on. It wasn't supposed to be triggered unless someone was moving in the driveway. I couldn't explain it. It was just a light turning on, but in that moment, it felt like an intrusion, an interruptee. My first instinct was to ignore it. It was probably just an animal, a raccoon or something, maybe wandering too close to the house. I told myself that, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping over me. The silence felt too thick now, the house too still. I lowered the volume on the TV and strained to listen, hoping to catch any sounds of movement or footsteps outside. But I couldn't stop thinking about the light. The fact that it had turned on was bothering me more than it should have. My mind began to race, filling the empty space with possibilities. What if it wasn't just an animal? What if someone was outside? Maybe it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the thought. I briefly considered just staying on the couch, pretending I hadn't noticed anything. But there was this rising pressure, a feeling in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't ignore. So I stood up slowly, my heart starting to beat a little faster than normal, and I moved toward the window. I lifted the blinds, just enough to get a glimpse of the driveway. My breath caught in my throat when I saw that the driveway was empty. No one was there, no animal, no person, just the quiet snow, undisturbed. Still, something felt wrong. There was a tension in the air now, an unspoken presence that I couldn't shake. The thought of going back to the couch and just pretending nothing had happened seemed impossible. I couldn't let it go. So I put on my shoes and walked outside, half hoping that seeing the empty driveway in person would ease my mind. The cold hit me the moment I stepped outside, sharp and biting, a stark contrast to the warmth inside the house. The snow crunched under my feet, the only sound in the otherwise silent night. I walked along the driveway, looking around, expecting to see an animal or even a fallen branch, but there was nothing. The light had turned on, but everything else was normal. I stood there for a moment, trying to collect myself. Maybe it really had just been an animal. But as I turned to head back inside, I heard it. A loud noise, like a bucket full of something heavy falling to the ground. It startled me, and I froze, listening intently. The motion-sensing light flickered on again, casting long shadows across the driveway. My mind was racing now, and my heart began to thud in my chest. I didn't want to go back inside. I didn't want to sit in that room, trapped in that same unsettling silence, wondering if someone was lurking just beyond the windows. The possibility of someone being out there made my skin crawl. It was the kind of thought that once planted, grew into something uncontrollable. So, I walked around the side of the house, hoping that the closer I got, the more I would convince myself that it was all just a misunderstanding. But when I reached the corner, there was no one there. No strange figures, no sounds, just the quiet night. It didn't make sense. My heart rate began to slow down, and I felt a brief wave of relief. Maybe it really had just been an animal. I turned to go back inside, trying to let go of the lingering feeling of dread. As I walked back into the house and settled back onto the couch, the tension in my chest still hadn't completely dissipated. I wanted to believe that everything was fine, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The light had turned on twice, and the weird noise I had heard outside wasn't something I could explain. I tried to push it to the back of my mind, but the nagging feeling remained. I kept looking at the door, listening for any sound, waiting for something else to happen. The silence of the house felt too heavy now, as if it was hiding something I wasn't meant to see. And then, as I sat there, frozen in that uncomfortable stillness, the knocking began. It was soft at first, almost tentative, like someone unsure whether to make their presence known. But then it grew louder, faster, more frantic. My stomach dropped. I knew that sound. It was coming from the window, the same window I had just looked through. I looked up from the TV screen, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to move. My feet felt glued to the floor, as if even the slightest motion would draw whatever was out there closer. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind, or maybe the house settling. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, as though someone or something was trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed 911. My voice was shaky, barely a whisper as I explained what was happening. "There's someone outside," I said, barely able to form the words. "They're knocking on the window." The knocking stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe they had gone away. But then I saw it. The shadow moved past the window, and I could make out the shape of a person standing there, their face just beyond the glass. And it was then that I saw her, a woman. She looked wild, with messy, unkempt hair and eyes that seemed far too wide for comfort. She was banging on the window now, her hands pressed against the glass, her body shaking with what looked like either fear or rage. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing, and tried to steady myself as I called the police again. I was too scared to move, too scared to go anywhere near the door. The sound of her knocking was relentless, as if she wouldn't stop until she was inside. I backed away from the door, and a moment later, I heard the sound of glass shattering. I was paralyzed, stuck between the need to hide and the fear of being found. My entire body was tense with terror, and I could barely breathe as I waited for the sound of sirens. Eventually, the police arrived, and I breathed a sigh of relief, though my heart still thudded in my chest. They arrested the woman and took her away, but I was left shaken, unsure of what had just happened. Who was she? What did she want? And why did I feel so exposed, so vulnerable, in my own home? It took a while for my heart to stop racing, for the fear to subside. But I learned something important that night. Fear doesn't always come from what you can see or understand. Sometimes it's the things that can't be explained that get under your skin. It's the unexpected, the uninvited, that makes you realize just how fragile your sense of safety can be. And once that sense of security is shattered, it's hard to ever feel completely at ease again. Even now, every time I'm alone in that room, I can't help but wonder if something or someone might be lurking just outside, that waiting to knock once more. It was one of those ordinary nights, one where the world outside felt quiet, the kind of silence that settles in and makes everything seem like it's in place. The house was calm, the kind of calm you only get when you're alone, and everything is just as it should be. I was sitting in the living room, wrapped up in a blanket, watching a random movie. Nothing special. It was a night I was hoping would just pass without incident, a rare opportunity to be by myself, to breathe in the solitude and have my own space to think. But life doesn't always allow for calm. The moment I started to feel at ease, that's when it happened, the flicker of a light outside. At first, I thought nothing of it. We had a motion-sensing light outside that would turn on when something moved. It was probably a raccoon or maybe a neighbor walking by. I didn't give it much attention, just shrugged it off and kept watching the movie. But then it happened again. The light turned on, this time more persistently. I felt a jolt run through me, like the light itself was pulling me out of my peaceful state and thrusting me into something uncertain, something unknown. I told myself it was nothing. It was probably just an animal. Yet there was an uneasiness I couldn't shake. The more I tried to ignore it, the stronger that feeling became. My heart started beating faster, the calm I had enjoyed slipping through my fingers. I reached for the remote, pausing the movie and lowering the volume, listening intently. I needed to hear if anything else was out of place, but there was nothing. The world outside was eerily quiet. That silence felt off, the kind of silence that makes your mind race, fills the empty space with possibilities that grow darker the longer you sit in them. After a few moments of sitting still, too nervous to move, I decided I would check it out, just to be sure. I told myself it was nothing, that there was no need to worry, but the dread gnawed at me, refusing to let go. So I grabbed my shoes and stepped outside, telling myself I'd just walk around the house, reassure myself that nothing was wrong, and go back inside to continue my evening. It was a simple task. Nothing could go wrong, I told myself. But the moment I stepped outside, a new level of discomfort settled over me. The cold hit me like a slap to the face, sharper than it should have been, and I felt an unfamiliar shiver creep up my spine. The light outside was still on, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the driveway. Every step I took on the frozen ground seemed to echo in the dead of the night, amplifying my every movement. The snow crunched beneath my feet, and for some reason, that sound seemed too loud, too deliberate. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary at first. The driveway was empty, no movement, no signs of life. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in, trying to breathe. Maybe it really was just an animal. I convinced myself of that, but the anxiety wasn't letting go. I walked further, pacing the driveway, scanning every inch of the yard, but nothing seemed out of place. And yet the dread lingered, clawing at my senses. That's when it happened. I heard it, a loud crash, like something heavy had fallen, an unmistakable sound that froze me where I stood. My heart jumped into my throat, and I instinctively turned toward the house, half expecting to see something or someone waiting for me. I glanced back at the motion-sensing light. It was still on, but now it felt different. The air around me felt charged, as though something was wrong, as though the calm of the night had been shattered. I stood there in the cold, feeling the tension rise within me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My instincts screamed at me to go back inside, to lock the door, to call someone. But the fear had already set in, and it pushed me forward. I was halfway back to the house when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A knock. Soft, almost tentative, but unmistakably a knock. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my chest. It came from the window, the one in the sunroom. I turned, instinctively looking back toward the house, expecting to see nothing, but I was wrong. There, in the darkness just beyond the window, I saw the faintest movement, a shadow, a figure. My heart skipped a beat. I should have turned and run back inside. I should have locked the door and called the police immediately. But instead, I stood there, frozen. Something in me felt paralyzed by the sight of that figure, by the certainty that this wasn't just some random person passing by. This wasn't a raccoon or a neighbor. This was something else entirely, someone who had no business being there. I looked closer, trying to make out the figure, but the darkness obscured the details. My mind raced, trying to understand what I was seeing. Was it a person? Was it someone I knew? Or was it a stranger? The questions piled on top of each other, filling the air with even more tension, more fear. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The knocking continued, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent, as though whoever was out there was demanding attention, trying to force me to acknowledge them, to respond. The sound was rhythmic, almost maddening in its persistence. It didn't stop, didn't give me a moment to breathe. I wanted to scream, but the words stuck in my throat. I felt paralyzed by the sound, by the presence just beyond the glass. And then the knocking stopped. There was a brief moment of silence, a pause that made the air feel thick and heavy, as though the world was holding its breath. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound, my mind racing through every possible explanation. But then a shadow moved across the window. I saw it unmistakably, a figure stepping closer, coming nearer to the door. A shiver ran down my spine. My mind screamed at me to get away, to lock the door, to hide, but I couldn't move. The figure outside was no longer just a shadow, it was a person, a woman. I couldn't make sense of it. Who was she? How had she gotten there? What did she want? Before I could process the questions running through my mind, I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of banging, harder this time, as though she was trying to break through. The door that separated the sunroom from the rest of the house was my only barrier, and I stood on the other side, heart pounding in my chest. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't let her in. I couldn't let someone like that into my home. The fear was consuming. Every instinct told me to lock the door, to hide, to get away, but I stood there, paralyzed, too afraid to move. The woman outside didn't stop. She kept banging on the window, her fists hitting the glass with desperation, as though she was trying to get inside, trying to reach me. I ran to the phone, trembling. My hands shook as I dialed 911, my voice cracking as I explained what was happening. I don't even remember what I said, but I know I was terrified. The fear I felt was so raw, so consuming, that I couldn't even think straight. All I could do was wait and pray and hope that someone would get there before it was too late. When the police finally arrived, I could barely speak. The woman was arrested, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Who was she? Why was she there? And what had she been trying to do? That night marked a turning point for me, one that I couldn't ignore. The sense of safety I had always taken for granted was shattered, replaced by a cold, unrelenting awareness that danger can strike when you least expect it. The fear of being confronted by a stranger in the middle of the night, someone who had no reason to be there, someone whose intentions I couldn't understand. It was a fear that would stay with me for a long time. In the days that followed, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, checking the locks on my doors more than once, and feeling that unsettling sense of vulnerability settle over me whenever I was alone. The woman's face, the way she pounded on the glass, those moments of fear, they stayed with me. The comfort of my own home, my own sanctuary, had been breached in a way I couldn't undo. And even though the police had removed the threat, I knew that the feeling of safety I had once taken for granted was gone. And that was the hardest part. The knowledge that someone I didn't even know had entered my life, my home, without invitation. And no matter how much I tried to forget it, the fear remained. The vulnerability remained. The awareness that I was never truly alone. That feeling would follow me for a long time. And every time I thought I had put it behind me, every time I settled back into the routine of normal life, I would remember the knock on the window, the woman outside, the terror that surged through me in those moments, the fear that never truly left. The house was silent again. In the midst of a winter retreat, surrounded by nothing but snow-covered trees and the eerie quiet of a secluded cabin, I thought I could finally enjoy the solitude. The world outside had turned cold and quiet, blanketed by the heavy snow that made everything seem still. The night was crisp, clear, and dark. The kind of night where you could hear the whisper of the wind and feel the solitude settling in. The perfect night for being alone. It was my first night back in the cabin for the season, and as usual, it felt strange to step into a place that had been empty for months. I had arrived the night before, unpacked my things, and settled into the quiet routine of it all. It always struck me as odd to be in this empty space, a house meant to be filled with laughter and life, now only echoing the sound of my own footsteps. But the quiet had a way of wrapping around me, like an old, familiar blanket, and I found myself settling into it, taking comfort in the solitude, at least for the first few hours. I'd already gone skiing that day and spent time with friends, so by nightfall, I was feeling the weight of exhaustion. I had a long drive ahead of me the next day, and the thought of a peaceful night's sleep felt like the best kind of luxury. But as I lay in bed, ready to drift into that quiet space between waking and sleeping, something caught my attention. It started innocently enough. I heard what sounded like a soft, playful laugh, almost like a child's. The sound was distant but distinct enough to reach my ears through the walls. It was the kind of laugh that belonged to children, high-pitched, carefree, and completely out of place in a house tucked away in the middle of the woods. My first thought was that it was a neighbor's child, someone from the house next door, perhaps playing outside. But I couldn't be sure. There weren't any other houses nearby, at least not that close, and the only house I knew for certain was mine. I sat up in bed, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end as I tried to reason with myself. There was no way a child could be out there this late, in this cold, in the middle of nowhere. I had driven past other houses on my way here, but none were close enough to make it seem like there would be kids out this late at night. And yet, the laughter came again, this time a little louder, clearer, almost as if it was right outside the window. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but the unease in the pit of my stomach grew. Maybe it was just the wind, carrying some stray noise from elsewhere. I told myself I was overthinking it, but the laughter didn't stop. It seemed to linger, circling the house, almost as if someone or something was standing just outside, laughing for no reason at all. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that this wasn't normal. The hair on my arm stood up as I listened, straining to hear the sounds. What I had initially thought was a harmless sound from a distant neighbor now seemed more sinister. I couldn't place it, but something about it didn't sit right. It was too unnatural, too out of place for the time and place I was in. I slipped out of bed and walked over to the window, my heart racing. I looked outside, half expecting to see something, anything, that could explain the laughter. The snow reflected the pale light of the moon, and the yard was empty. There was no one out there, no children playing, no reason for the sound. But still, the laughter echoed in my ears. I backed away from the window, feeling like I had crossed some invisible line. The idea of being in this empty, dark house, surrounded by trees and snow, and hearing something that didn't belong there, it felt wrong, like I was trespassing in a space that wasn't mine. I thought of leaving the window open, thinking that maybe it was the wind carrying something strange from farther away, but that only made me feel more vulnerable, like something unseen was creeping closer. The laughter faded, but it wasn't gone. It lingered in the air, in the quiet spaces of the house, like a presence that couldn't be easily shaken. I lay back down, pulling the blankets up tightly around me, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, nothing more. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That something, or someone, was outside, just beyond the thin walls of the cabin. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the laughter returned. It wasn't loud this time, but it was clearer, more distinct. It came from outside again, only this time it was closer. I could hear it through the thin walls of the cabin, as if the sound was being directed straight at me, taunting me, forcing me to acknowledge it. The laugh was followed by a sound that made my heart stop. A ball, something round, bright red, was sitting in the middle of the snow on my front lawn. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I was certain of it. I hadn't seen it earlier, and I couldn't explain how it had gotten there. It was odd, to say the least, and a deep sense of dread settled into my stomach. Why was there a ball in the snow at all? Who would leave something like that out here in the middle of nowhere? I convinced myself it was just a weird coincidence, but the nagging feeling remained. It felt wrong. The ball didn't belong there, and neither did the laughter. By the time I had finished trying to convince myself it was all just some weird fluke, I had already lost my resolve. I went outside, stepping into the biting cold, the crunch of the snow beneath my boots the only sound that seemed to matter now. I picked up the ball and tossed it over the fence, back onto the neighbor's property, figuring it must have somehow rolled into my yard. I couldn't explain why, but I felt better when I did. The next day, after a long day of skiing, I came back to the cabin, exhausted and ready for a restful night. But as I pulled into the driveway, something made me stop. The red ball was sitting in the snow on my front lawn once again, in exactly the same spot as before. My stomach twisted. I hadn't seen anyone around, and the ball shouldn't have been there. I picked it up again and threw it over the fence, trying to shake off the unease that was starting to creep in. It didn't make sense. How could it get back here every time I threw it over the fence? Was someone messing with me? Was this some strange prank? Or was I just being paranoid? The next night, I woke up in the middle of the night to laughter again. But this time, it was different. It was like the laughter was coming from all around me, echoing off the walls, as if the sound was coming from inside my own house. It didn't feel like it was coming from outside anymore. It was closer, too close, and I could feel it vibrating through the floorboards. I rushed to the window, my heart racing, but there was nothing, no one in sight. But then I looked down at the lawn. The ball was back. This time I didn't throw it over the fence. Instead, I picked it up and brought it inside with me. Something about the ball, about the way it had appeared so suddenly and kept returning, unsettled me. It didn't make sense. It didn't belong here. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow tied to whatever was happening, whatever was haunting me. The next morning, I left for skiing, hoping that when I came back, everything would be normal. When I returned later that day, the ball was gone. It wasn't in the living room where I had left it. It wasn't anywhere. It was then that I began to truly feel the weight of the dread that had been building inside me. Someone or something had been in my house. The ball didn't just move itself, but how and why? What was the connection? Why had it appeared and disappeared like this? Was I being haunted by something? Was I being stalked? That evening, after the day had ended, I sat by the window, staring out into the yard. The snow was still, and the air was thick with cold, but then, just as I began to lose hope that I would ever get any answers, I saw it. A shadow, a figure, a child, standing still in the snow, staring at me. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, perfectly still, like it was waiting for something. I couldn't explain it. I could feel my heart race, and I couldn't tear my eyes away. I didn't know if I was supposed to approach, if I should call for help, or if I should just run. In that moment, I realized the ball wasn't just a random object. It was a message, a signal, and I didn't know what to make of it. This was no coincidence. Something was happening, something beyond my understanding. The red ball, the laughter, the figure in the snow, it was all connected. But to what end? What did it all mean? Was it some kind of warning? A sign of something far more sinister? The thought alone made my breath catch. There was no escaping the fact that I had been part of something I couldn't understand. Something that felt as though it had been waiting for me all along. And in that moment, I realized that no matter how far I tried to run from it, I would never fully be able to escape the feeling that something else, something I couldn't see or understand, was always lurking just beyond the edge of my reality, waiting for me to turn around. In the end, the protagonist's unsettling experiences in the quiet, isolated house serve as a stark reminder of how easily our sense of security can be shattered. What began as a peaceful, solitary retreat soon spiraled into a series of inexplicable and terrifying events. The motion-sensing light turning on without explanation, the strange knocking on the window, and the eerie presence of a mysterious figure. The ball that reappeared on the lawn, the laughter in the night, and the unnerving sight of a child standing still in the snow. Each of these moments escalated the feeling of vulnerability, proving that even in the most peaceful of places, there are things beyond our understanding. The protagonist's journey was one of fear, confusion, and ultimately, the realization that no matter how much we try to control our environment, there will always be elements that remain outside our grasp. These unsettling occurrences challenged their sense of safety and left them with an enduring feeling of unease. The profound lesson from this story lies in the acceptance of life's unpredictability. It teaches us that no matter how hard we try to create a bubble of safety, we cannot always control what happens around us. Fear, uncertainty, and the unknown are inevitable parts of life. And while we cannot avoid them, we must learn how to navigate through them with resilience. The story encourages us to face our fears, trust our instincts, and be aware of the hidden forces around us, both the tangible and the intangible, that can influence our sense of security. In life, we must remain vigilant, adaptable, and prepared for the unknown. If you enjoyed this story and found it thought-provoking, please consider subscribing to our channel to support us, and stay tuned for more content that dives deep into intriguing and mysterious stories. Your support motivates us to continue creating and sharing more captivating content in the future.